So 20 years ago, my background really is an environmental writer and campaigner for the last 20 years. And in the last few years, I've got very involved in campaigning around psychedelic medicine research. And I've always felt that psychedelics could play a very important part in what is necessary, not for everybody necessarily, but I think something very unique and peculiar to the psychedelic experience is that it does erode this sort of conceptual separation between us and nature. And when I wrote this book 20 years ago, there was a quote by Buckminster Fuller, which I've really seized upon and used ever since, was that you never create change by fighting the existing reality. You have to build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And that's really what the regeneration is trying to do, is to provide a platform and a space for a conversation to move forward about what the viable alternative solutions are to the various crises that we face. And as much as I admire something like Extinction Rebellion and see it as incredibly important to have this sort of civil disobedience movement, I think it's equally, if not more important, that we have a platform to really discuss what the alternative scenarios are. So that's really what I'm trying to do here. What I also mentioned in this book was, literally in one or two lines, was this role that psychedelic medicines and plants and compounds could play in provoking this biophiliac notion, what E.O. Wilson called biophilia, this sense of this innate connection to the natural world. I was, of course, ridiculed at the time by a couple of reviewers who, of course, immediately sort of wrote the whole book off as a load of hippie nonsense. But I'm rather delighted that 20 years later, what I was saying there has very much been vindicated and validated by current research, and we might have a moment to dip into that later. Okay, so that's a little bit of context about what we're doing here, and without further ado, move on to introduce our amazing three guests here, the wonderful Amanda Feilding, who's been at the forefront of this for decades now and has really sort of paved the way for so many people around the world in this area. And really none of us would be here without what she's achieved so far. So we're very, very happy to be here. And I think it's very interesting to see what an enormous audience we have for this event. It's certainly more attended and subscribed than the event so far. So there's obviously a huge thirst for this kind of stuff out there. So I think that's fantastic. And then we've got two Davids. I noticed earlier today that David Luke on my left is David L with my left and David Restrepo on my right. Slightly confusing for you, I know. But David I've worked with for a few years now. We co-edited a book that was published last year called DMT Dialogues, and there'll be copies available after this and signing if anybody's interested. And that was really transcripts from a symposium we held in 2015 at Tyringham Hall, which was designed by Sir John Soane, who coincidentally also designed this room. And we did a series of events. We've done 3 symposiums on DMT now. We're hoping that the second symposium will also be published. The first one had 10 world luminaries in the sort of DMT world, from Graham Hancock to Jeremy Narby, Rupert Sheldrake, Dennis McKenna, etc. Rick Strassman, who famously wrote DMT, the Spirit Molecule, for those of you who are interested in this sort of thing. And David works at Greenwich and also very involved with the Imperial Beckley Research Programme. So we'll be talking to David a bit about all of that. And then on my right is David Restrepo, who I only met recently, about a year ago, when he was just heading off to Colombia to start some really very sort of innovative, groundbreaking new research into the potential medicinal therapeutic benefits of the coca leaf. And of course, most of us have, completely associate coca with cocaine. And in fact, this incredibly sacred plant, which is a sort of superfood par excellence and has the most incredible properties, and medicinal properties too, and therapeutic properties. So very excited to hear about the work that he's doing, and I think some very interesting questions there about how we can take what are essentially these sacred plant medicines and abominate them and turn them into poisons, rather like we've done with tobacco. So that's sort of where we're going to go, and I'm going to start now with Amanda. And as many of you know, and as witnessed by all of you here, we are well into now what's being called a psychedelic renaissance. There was this sort of 50-year moratorium on psychedelic research since the late 60s, and it's only sort of really reawoken in the last few years. And I was just wondering if Amanda could actually tell us what she saw, were there any defining sort of moments that allowed this new wave of research to happen? Why are we suddenly allowed to go back into this space and all of this research come back into the open?
Hello, good morning. I think really this new phase comes break through 50 years of taboo by being carried on the back of first-class scientific studies. I realized that back in the 60s. I got involved in this world in 1965, 66, when I suddenly then realized that psychedelics were an amazing door into so many areas which humanity needed. And I was lucky enough to meet a Dutch scientist, doctor, who had two hypotheses about how psychedelics change the blood circulation in the brain, which I think is very relevant, and also about the ego, how it controls our behavior. And so starting from that, I had studied consciousness. That had always been my passion. And then I got this revelation of LSD and a possible hypothesis of how the brain works at the physiological level, being affected, the altered states of consciousness. So that really became my passion. And then one saw the terrifying doors of repression come and close the whole thing down. And it was quite obviously crazy. It was a terrible, terrible mistake mankind was making. It was quite obvious we should carefully, slowly learn to integrate this new knowledge about psychedelics into the web of society, like India and many old nations have managed. In India, I know a very high-up minister who was in almost every position, and he said that Indians have no word for addiction. Before the Americans came and forced addiction into prohibition into the system, they didn't get addicted. It was controlled by the mores of the society. And so we made a terrible mistake. It was very convenient for the Americans because it got them into every country, like yours, that they wanted to get into. So it was a thing of convenience, and the media went completely full-hearted with them. So it was the total doors of repression closing upon these potentially amazingly valuable compounds, which can really help us navigate this very difficult territory we've got to now, with having learned so much but actually not having evolved at all, kind of spiritually, emotionally, and being a little bit out of control. And as we are at the moment, have indeed entered an epidemic of mental illness, and we're in desperate need of help. So
can we just put, I think depression and addiction are two massive issues, obviously, completely, there's a sort of pandemic. Could you bring us up to date now then with what are the most exciting developments with your research now in terms of bringing some of these compounds into a sort of clinical regulated setting for treating depression or addiction?
Right. Well, I think the most exciting thing is that now it is an open fact that to do psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, that means introducing the psychedelic into the therapy, and that enables, and that's what our brain imaging research has shown, what it enables in terms of changes in brain function to a certain basic degree. Basically, a psychedelic expands everything, but it diminishes the blood to the default mode network. And this is the kind of center part of the ego. So by reducing the blood flow to the repressive part of the brain, suddenly there's much less repression. So there's much more freedom. So the whole brain is interrelated with each other, and it becomes a different form of consciousness, one which can be the ground for the mystical experience, which is at the very core of our religious, spiritual happenings around the world.
I think that is incredibly interesting because I'm sure many of you are aware of Aldous Huxley's work, The Doors of Perception, when he famously took mescaline and was, arguably one of the things that sort of kick-started the psychedelic revolution. But he talked about the brain as a sort of reducing valve, and one of the sort of central components of what I've been talking about here, and what I really will be talking about with Shane and Russell in terms of our understanding of consciousness, is an increasing number of people talking about the possibility that consciousness isn't just this weird phenomenon generated by the brain, but something much more implicit and fundamental to the nature of reality and the universe itself. And so Huxley, I think, described the brain as this sort of reducing valve that actually just sort of has to, because of the overwhelming amount of information at its disposal, just allow that which is relevant to seep through. So what I think there's a correlation potentially here with this notion that the psychedelic compounds reduce the activity of this default mode network, which is essentially a scientific term for the egoic construct, this notion of identifying ourselves with our thoughts, actions, words, and deeds, and with the physical organism, and allowing the sort of background state of consciousness to emerge and come more into the fore. And that is why people have this deeply connecting experience with each other or with the natural world. And I think anybody who's had a full-blown psychedelic experience, it's very, very difficult to come out the other end of that and still have the same conception of being this sort of separated, skin-encapsulated ego, as Alan Watts called it. Do you think that is sort of a sort of...
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a correlation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what we've discovered, because we've done both research with the depression-resistant patient, basically the first group was depression-resistant for an average of 18 years, so they were seriously depressive. And they had 2 small trips of psilocybin. And what we found is that those ones who hit the mystical experience, which is the kind of loss of ego, dissolution of the ego, with certain characteristics such as a feeling of spirituality or unity with whatever it is, all of those experiences which together become what is classically known as the mystical experience. So the people who went through that experience were the ones who were the most successful in overcoming their problems. And that is rather wonderful that that experience is the most neuroplastic. It means that when a new setting can come in and seed itself and take place, and that's what can happen with a psychedelic assisted therapy. So the setting is lovely, beneficial, and the substance enables them to reach that level, like in a farm. I was a farmer's daughter. You know, you get the soil ready to receive the seed and then to blossom. And that's what a psychedelic does. It puts the state of consciousness at a level where the person can have this feeling of unity, a higher level, and therefore lose their old maladaptive settings and open up to a new, better one. And I think that's very exciting.
Well, I suppose, in a sense, that the weight of evidence is so overwhelming now about the potential benefits of these compounds that it's hard to keep them in the box, really. It's so their efficacy at treating depression and addiction for this neuroplasticity, neurogenesis of sort of actually be able to instill sort of new patterns of behavior is really remarkable. And when they're used with intention rather than sort of purely recreationally, then you have this very different kind of possibility. And that's, again, something maybe we can touch on more later. But David, so I think let's talk about DMT now, which is a very slightly different compound in the sense that it's the only endogenous psychedelic. You know, we're all making DMT in our bodies all the time. It's pretty much ubiquitous in nature. It's in every living tissue where scientists have ever looked for it. It's a very ancient molecule. It's a very simple molecule, but it's clearly, if there is a compound in our bodies that is the sort of conduit between spirit and matter, there's a lot to suggest that it's DMT. But DMT doesn't seem to necessarily have a sort of an immediate sort of therapeutic clinical application for treating, say, depression or addiction, or LSD is apparently incredibly the only compound that's known to cure cluster headaches. But DMT, which is in its own pure synthesized format an incredibly potent compound, when it's embedded within the sort of matrix of the ayahuasca brew, then you have this much more extended experience, which is arguably a much more of a psychological journey and allows much more space for there to be a sort of therapeutic process. But the DMT experience conventionally is so shattering and so brief, it's very hard to sort of enter into a kind of therapeutic space with it. But clearly, it might have some sort of, therapeutic potential as well. But I'll just be really interested, I know that you and Amanda are collaborating on this Beckley Imperial study around DMT, and I'd love to hear some news about that and where you're at with that and what the potential benefits of this research might be. Please.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Rory. So, extraordinarily. So there's been a lot of work looking at the clinical applications of psychedelics, and that is extraordinary because they have vast clinical applications in treating depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on. I think there may even be a role for DMT in particularly addictions. There's a lot of anecdotal reports of people coming off crack, for instance, with DMT. Just, with 1 10-minute experience can be sufficient for some people. But the clinical stuff aside, some of the more interesting stuff, and I think this is where Amanda has really excelled, because she hasn't just focused on the clinical work, she's been doing a lot of the neuroscience, so the basic kind of grasp and understanding of how psychedelics function in the human brain, and that underpins a lot of new understanding about the nature of human consciousness and how it works and functions, which is extraordinary. So Amanda has kind of really pioneered some extraordinary work and helped pretty much single-handedly get this Psychedelic Renaissance off the ground in the UK, which is excellent. But that leads us on to some of the more kind of interesting ontological kind of questions about the nature of reality and the nature of consciousness. And given that DMT is kind of present in the human body, quite possibly in the human brain, it throws up a lot of questions about, so what is the role of DMT? How can we have this extremely potent psychedelic substance floating around us all the time? When people take DMT, it's a 10-minute experience, which may not necessarily cure your addictions, but it does cure atheism, I'm reliably told. It can literally be a very life-changing experience. So is it that spontaneous mystical experiences of all varieties are somehow have DMT involved in them? Is this the kind of the catalyst within us which gives rise to these kind of extremely profound changes that occur? So we're beginning now to ask these kind of more transpersonal kind of questions, these questions which seek to kind of understand the human identity beyond the personal ego. And so we're looking at some really extraordinary phenomena, such as shared visionary experiences, which are very commonly reported with ayahuasca, for instance, where people have ceremonies, they have the experience of sharing the same visionary experience with other people in that group. We're also looking at some other extraordinary phenomena as well, like the experience of telepathy, or even transcending time and space and getting information back from the future, and also having kind of insight, revelations, discoveries. So we are pioneering work with top-level researchers in how they can access information that they don't ordinarily have access to in gaining insights and breakthroughs in their own research.
Are you able to share with us any particular example in that sense? Or
well, it's somewhat still embargoed currently, but I could probably, if nobody tells anybody, we could probably promise not to say anything. Well, I would say that the initial research, because it's in the early stages at the minute, we're piloting it in a field research, quite literally in fields sometimes, where we go around to people's houses or in a park or something, and they take DMT and we just do some experiments with them. We've had some extraordinary results so far. In terms of the shared visionary experience, for instance, when two people come together, they take DMT together, and then you look at the degree of correspondence between their visionary experience, we were kind of quite surprised to see that there is a very good degree of overlap as well. So, and one of the other things as well, we're looking to see the nature of psychedelic experiences with blind people. Particularly congenitally blind people, because these are kind of a very special subset of people who, if you're blind from birth, you don't ordinarily have access to any kind of mental imagery or visual experience. You've no concept of what seeing is, of light and dark, other than as an abstract or linguistic kind of construct. and yet we've found that people have had near-death experiences. Do you everyone know what a near-death experience is? The classic thing where you have some kind of physical trauma, perhaps. You're lying on the floor, you seem to pop out of your body, you're floating up above, you're looking down at your body, and the paramedics go along, try and resuscitate. You see a tunnel of light, your life flashes before you, you get to the end of the tunnel of light, and a couple of your relatives go, "No, it's not your time, you've got to think of the kids." You're back into your body, just as you're being resuscitated. Yeah, we've all been there, haven't we? So extraordinary. This is a very visual phenomena, and extraordinarily when congenitally blind people, at least 2/3 of them, have those experiences, they get a lot of visual phenomena as well. They see their body from a disembodied perspective. How that occurs, we can't really explain. It seems like some kind of direct perception. So this kind of has huge implications for the nature of consciousness, as we're also beginning to explore blind people, congenitally blind people's experiences with psychedelics, and I think we'll find something similar happening there.
Just very quickly then, would you say, has your understanding of consciousness shifted in the last 10, 20 years with this research? What's that journey? How's that journey taken you?
Probably the last 30 years. yeah. Very much so. And I think it throws up all manner of questions about the nature of reality. And like I say, you know, DMT and other psychedelics have this profound capacity to shift people from an atheist perspective. What we're finding is it makes people actually more kind of engaged with like ideas like dualism or idealism, whereby consciousness and mind are either separate or consciousness itself is primary. Even after just one psychedelic experience, you know, people stop being these kind of reductionist, materialist, atheist perspectives. Well, I'm not saying either is right, but it gives people a new perspective on things. And I think also a lot of the research and data coming through when we're allowed to ask these kinds of questions tends to support these worldviews that, you know, the brain doesn't necessarily produce consciousness. There seems to be something broader and more interesting going on than that.
Fascinating. David, leaving parking psychedelics for a moment, coca, can you give us a little summary of the extraordinary attribute or potential for this sacred ancient plant?
Sure. Yes. Hello. Ooh. Is this working? Okay, perfect. Well, that's a really interesting question. I guess recently I've been more focused on policy issues, but it's an area that I've tried to understand, because I think without understanding the culture, the plant, we can't really get into the depths of policy. And the reason I'm so interested in policy is, you know, I was born in Colombia, grew up in Colombia, had to endure the consequences of drug policy on society and on my personal life, and is one of the major reasons I had to leave. And when I chose, I lived in the UK and became actually a British citizen for 10 years. I was seeking to do something more meaningful for my country, and the idea of working on coca, which is probably the greatest orphan of the whole drug policy and drug research world. And it's a very ironic thing, because actually coca has been responsible probably for the formation of our contemporary world. You know, we wouldn't have modern surgery without coca, which is the plant where cocaine is derived. And cocaine was the first modern anesthetic and gave rise to modern surgery. We wouldn't have the modern beverage industry without coca. In fact, we have everybody who has drunk Coca-Cola is still drinking coca leaf extract to this present day. Coca-Cola doesn't want you to know about it, but it's still there. So coca is a very interesting, very complex, very subtle plant. And I would like to maybe delve into that a little bit, because I think one of the challenges with coca is that the experience of coca is actually very mild. When you take coca leaf, it's like a very effective but very gentle stimulant. And it's an effect that goes away very quickly as soon as you finish consuming coca. So I think a lot of people, when they consume the plant, they're okay, is that it? You know, whereas when they're taking ayahuasca or taking magic mushrooms, they can't believe the experience. And in addition to that, I think there's a very big chasm between the indigenous world, where coca leaf has this profound significance, and the Western world, that from the very first time that a Spaniard conquistador saw an indigenous person chewing coca leaf, he was, what's that about? And there are these horrible chronicles where Spaniards are saying very nasty things about indigenous people because they're using coca leaf. And so this misunderstanding around coca, I think, persists to this very day. But I've had the honor, the privilege to be part of some of that culture and join ceremonies where coca is used. And in fact, it is probably as profound an experience as psychedelics. And I've been trying to, there's not much written on this actually. There's some anthropological studies, and this is another area that is orphaned. There's some really interesting anthropology done with indigenous communities, but I think much more is required. And I would say that the psychedelic experience, as I understand, it can be very much about deep introspection. The coca experience is about deep extrospection. It's about being able to understand the world here and now and how it's interconnected and your relationships within that world. And the vehicle of that insight is communication. So coca is the plant of loving and very deep communication. So when indigenous people consume coca, it's a mild stimulant that allows them to be very open to their community and to have something like a town hall where there is a lot of storytelling and really conversing deeply about what is required for the community to move forward. And the community in many of these indigenous cosmologies is not just the human community. It is also about the natural community. So, mountains are sacred, different parts of the landscape are sacred, and they have information for the community, and they are in relationship to that community. So that reciprocity between the human and the natural world is a central part of that coca culture, and coca is the vehicle that permits that communication to take place. I think that many of these issues that you're talking about, depression and addiction and so on, are often a result of a very isolating society. And it's interesting also how cocaine is an isolated and purified substance. Coca is not an isolated, it's a whole plant with many alkaloids, many nutrients, and the ritual is not isolating at all. It is all about integration. So I think I haven't fully kind of figured out the narrative to make this very sharp, very easy to explain. But I would say that the spiritual and philosophical depth of coca is as comparable as for any other of the master plants.
Fascinating. And when I was reading the other day, it's got sort of 40 plus nutrients, every sort of vitamin you've ever heard of, more calcium than any vegetable ever tested, more iron than red meat in terms of weight. So there's no signs of osteoporosis in the tribes that use it and stuff. So it's a remarkable thing, and it's a remarkable medicine. But of course, in the same way that we've taken, in a way, the highest medicine of all within these Native American traditions is tobacco. But interestingly, they don't fill it with chemicals and inhale it into their lungs. They might smoke it in a pipe or a sort of mapacho's cheroot and sniff it as a snuff. But then the physiological impact on your system is a very different thing to burning it and putting all these carcinogens in our lungs. So I think that's something that we tend to overlook. Amanda, are there lots of questions, by the way, already? I just want to sort of use our time effectively. Are people keen with questions? Okay, so brilliant. Well, we'll keep on cracking on. Amanda, then, so currently, what's your focus right now? What's the most exciting thing going on at the moment with Beckley? And how can everybody, all of those interested in these sort of issues, how can we all sort of get involved helpfully to move this forward?
I mean, I'm very non-specific. I'm very bad at not being interested in things. So it's very wide, the interest I have. And one of my early passions, and still is LSD, which is a kind of Cinderella of the psychedelics, and I think at the same time the most interesting. So at the moment I'm very much pushing that forward by doing very, very interesting research at cellular, animal and human levels to see how it works to enhance neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, those sort of things, and how that can be relevant in wider pictures. And also an old passion of mine, right back from the 60s, was what is now called microdosing. So I'm at the moment involved in some of the first microdosing lab studies, which is incredibly boring because doing it in a lab, you have to go through an amazing number of very restrictive, expensive things like sitting in the lab all day, and then you have to pay for the lab and pay this and pay that. So it becomes ridiculously expensive. We're also doing a survey study, but then with a placebo. But there's a lot, I think there's such a breakthrough of possibility at the moment in using these compounds and cannabis to the betterment of humanity. And that's what we've blocked for 60 years. So we can very quickly move forward, catching up the lost ground. And I think they're just an amazing, synergetic, they always used to be called the food of the gods, and I think that is in a sense what they are. We're very lucky to be able to now start making use of them in a thoroughly
psychovitamins, as they've been called in Silicon Valley. And actually, I'm glad you brought up microdosing, which I think is a really fascinating area. And I was talking with our wonderful cameraman Sam Oliver here a few days ago about this, and I was talking about this notion of biophilia and it breaking down the separation from nature and all of these wonderful things. But he also pointed out that, of course, if people in Silicon Valley are using it to boost their performance, and people are talking about sort of their cognitive performance being increased by sort of X 100% and their productivity going up, there is, of course, then an argument that this microdosing use is actually driving further sort of carbon emissions and more productivity. So that, I guess there are no one-ended sticks. There's always kind of something going on in the opposite direction. But David, can I come back to you then with this notion about where does the use of one of these compounds drift from being recreational to being constructive and beneficial? And I think people talk a lot about using these things with intent within a ceremonial context, where it's a pretty grey line between that and potentially doing that in your own living room with a bunch of friends. When does it become a recreational abuse of the compound, and how might we sort of navigate that going forward in terms of if these things get regulated or decriminalised or legalised?
Yeah, interesting one. So I mean, currently all use is misuse, because the Misuse of Drugs Act, as it was, so there wasn't ever any use or kind of any range for any other kind of use other than all use was misuse. So under legally defined, it's all misuse. But so the notion of recreational use has also kind of got very blurry distinctions, because that's the kind of catch-all phrase for anybody who uses these things outside of a clinical context, and yet people use them for all kinds of reasons. And it may be that you take it in a kind of hedonistic context, but you may well have a spiritual breakthrough, a kind of a psychological revelation, or some kind of great ingenious idea. So there's many different uses, and I think a lot of it is driven by the context, the set and the setting, your intentions, and how you enter into the experience. So I was lucky enough to take to kind of oversee the running of this LSD research project, where we gave 40 top-level scientists from Oxford and Cambridge and Imperial, they're all PhDs or postdocs, LSD with a view to kind of creative problem-solving, like blockages they had in their research. Again, the research on that is embargoed, so I'd have to kill you all if I told you the findings. But other than to say that I think everybody had some kind of breakthrough of one kind or another. So any kind of, it depends on the intentions and the setting. So you could have a recreational use of psychedelics and still have a lot of great revelations and discoveries, or have a whole night of whole year's worth of psychotherapy in one night, spontaneously. And that's the nature of psychedelics, is you don't necessarily always know what you're going to get.
Indeed. I think this leads on to another, what I think is a very important conversation for all of us to be having. I think as a culture, we're a bit of a muddle about intoxication generally. I think there's still a sort of overhang from a sort of slightly sort of Victorian sort of puritanical notion about it, that anything that alters your consciousness is inherently bad. Certain scientists now say that the desire to alter our consciousness is the fourth greatest biological urge. I was watching children just yesterday afternoon rolling down this hill and spinning around in circles until they got dizzy. There's something there from a very early age where we want to kind of, get out of our heads somehow. We want to alter our consciousness somehow. So I think it's a very sort of complex and sort of nuanced conversation there, because of course the two legally sanctioned intoxicants or drugs in our society are potentially two of the most negative and the worst for us. Alcohol and tobacco kill 200,000 people a year in this country. I don't think a single death certificate has ever been written for a psychedelic or for LSD, like LSD. There might have been circumstantial deaths, but no one has ever died for the inherent toxicity of the drug. These drugs are non-toxic and non-addictive. And they get lumped together with narcotics like crystal meth and crack and heroin and put in the same schedule bracket, but they are fundamentally very different compounds. And that sort of awareness is beginning to seep out, but it's been much repressed. And I think it's very important for us to start sort of looking at all of that, and the notion that the desire to alter consciousness might not necessarily be inherently bad. It might not necessarily be driven by escapism. It might be more about exploration and about self-improvement. I was watching this great documentary about the Grateful Dead the other day, who I'm sort of I've always been rather interested in. And this very interesting phenomenon in the late 60s, once the psychedelic explosion had happened, and they were trying to put the genie back in the bottle. But of course, what then came in were the narcotics. Everyone started to, all these big bands, all the rock stars stopped taking acid and smoking pot and started doing heroin and cocaine, and ipso facto all started having terrible trouble. So again, I think, where does escapism and the line between escapism and self-exploration lie? And maybe that's something that, David, you could answer in relation to coca and your experience with indigenous communities in relation to cocaine use in the West. And Amanda, maybe you could then follow and talk about that in relation to psychedelics.
Well, I think it's really interesting. I have a bit of a critical view here, because I actually, I've never, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I've never actually tried cocaine, because it is a very traumatic substance if you're a Colombian, and somehow the stigma surrounding it, the consequences of it, but I think that feeling that I have is problematic. Not that I should try cocaine or that I'm advocating people to try cocaine, but I think we sometimes conflate the substance and the system and the policy. And actually, I see in some progressive newspapers this angle, which is trying to blame cocaine use in Britain and in other first world countries for the troubles of Colombia and the rainforest destruction and the violence and the et cetera. And I actually don't think that cocaine is the source of the problem. And I would like for people interested in psychedelics to be a little bit to kind of inquire a little bit around the policy infrastructure that is actually responsible for the destruction of the rainforests in Colombia, for the thousands of people who are in jail, et cetera, et cetera. So, even though I personally don't find cocaine interesting, and when I see some friends taking cocaine, some of them behave in really strange ways that I don't find that fun. I don't think the problem is necessarily the cocaine itself. It's everything that surrounds it, and everything that surrounds it is built by the policy. And so I think it's important for us to have that conversation.
I totally agree. I think the whole problem comes out of the prohibition. And that's what's kind of separated the two sides. I actually don't think there's much of a difference between this dirty word recreational use and scientific use. They're completely artificial and brought here by this ridiculous prohibition, which has kind of upset the natural balance of everything. And I actually have been involved in writing a report on regulation of cocaine for many years now, because I advised the Guatemalan government, and I said, obviously the core problem is the use of cocaine. They don't even use it in Guatemala, but they pass it through. And it's just a death march. And so I set about doing expert's book on regulation of cocaine. And the amazing thing is, I've been doing it for many, many years, and it's now hopefully coming to an end, but there's no one in the world, no one academic in that world who is prepared to write about the regulation of cocaine. I mean, I know them because I've done regulation, and I know the top one is Peter Reuter, and I asked him 5 years ago, would he do a chapter of it? And no, he said, it will never be regulated. And that's completely mad. It's missing the point that we need to regulate these compounds to learn how to protect our youth against having dirty things, not having knowledge. It's a win-win situation to regulate.
Wonderful. Well, that leads, let's talk a bit about policy now before we have some questions. So I'd love to, all of your thoughts on this. Total, decriminalisation, legalisation. What's your vision of how you would see all of these compounds, not just the psychedelics, but other drugs too? How would you see the legislation go in your best case scenario?
It's an interesting question, and it's actually there's a recent kind of issue around this with Michael Pollan's been speaking out about this. You probably all know the very famous food writer has now written a book about psychedelics, and he's been coming out and saying, we don't want legalization of psychedelics, is in favor of decriminalization, and it's quite a nuanced argument. And I guess the question is, who do you trust most to regulate the drugs, the users, or capitalist commercialized system and the government? And he presumably trusts the users to regulate it better than the government because he's in favor of decriminalization rather than legalization. His concerns being that the way in which cannabis is being legalized and commercialized, has some kind of concerns in terms of that cannabis companies and producers and suppliers are kind of using advertising and have huge billboards up all over in the States saying, come and buy your cannabis here, or we can deliver. I guess that's more an issue of how the drugs are dealt with in the States rather than a legalization versus decriminalization issue. It's to do with, advertising of potentially addictive or, substances which may be overused or in great supply and demand. So I think if we are going to go down the legalization route, we should apply the same kind of advertising standards as we do with tobacco, for instance, and that would probably circumvent some of those concerns about these things being pushed by kind of corporate entities. Because these substances aren't for everybody, and there does need to be a kind of huge degree of education around their use. And the good thing is that within the psychedelic community, there is a actual community of people there who are very experienced and are very pro-education and the uses of these things in the right context to reduce harms. I mean, everyone talks about nobody really talks. I mean, they're starting to talk about the reduction of harms now, or benefit maximization. That's the other side of the thing as well. Nobody really talks about benefit maximization because there's a lot to gain from the use of these things. So I don't know, I'm just talking in circles really, but I think that there's arguments both for just decriminalization and legalization, I think, but we need to have the systems in place to move towards legalization. I'm not sure we necessarily do have that ready yet. What I think we need to do is first make it legal for the medical use of these substances, and I think the whole process will naturally follow and unfurl.
So Portugal is obviously a sort of a leading light in this area, and just treating the whole issue of addiction and drug dependency as a social issue rather than a criminal issue, and it just seems to me that's just a completely obvious first step.
Yeah, and they've had amazing success. They had the highest rate of everything bad in Europe 12 years ago, and now we've got the highest rate of everything bad, and they've got the lowest rate. So it works.
Yeah,
and it's ridiculous that we haven't adopted it, but we've had Theresa May and whoever else, and they're all completely blind to the obvious truth. The human problem, we might say.
Other things too. David, please.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point about legalization, because and coca and cocaine offer a really interesting perspective here, also for scientists, because when cocaine was first isolated in Germany in the mid-19th century, there was a lot of scientific interest around the plant. Why does this plant make people so strong and work so hard and so on? And the scientists were trying to find what was the actual molecule that was causing this. And there's a great book by a guy named Paul Gutenberg called Andy and Cocaine, which everybody should read if they're interested in drug policy and generally these issues, because I think it has a lot of reflections for us today. But I think what happened there was there was a lot of interest in coca and in cocaine, and all of that information and the intellectual property was privatized, and there was very little interest in the indigenous communities and the cultural setting and all this environment that through millennia has figured out how to benefit maximize a plant and its compounds. And so what we're trying to do at the Universidad de los Andes, where I'm leading this research program on coca, is to ensure that from the outset, and we're very early days, and we think this is fairly pioneering work, from the very outset, the way that we are identifying new knowledge isn't just held in the hands of a university or a company or a scientist, but actually this knowledge is able to reach us because communities for thousands of years have been cultivating that knowledge and building it up and understanding what it's about. And actually, we think that they should be leading the research program and that they should be owning the intellectual property. And that I don't think we really know what the model is yet, and we're in the process. I wanted to talk about all the research that we are trying to do and all the applications that coca has. But I don't think we should get too excited until we have figured out a way that scientists and communities and whoever is going to commercially exploit this information have agreed the way forward. Otherwise, we're going to very much replicate what happened in the 19th century and what some people are arguing is already happening with cannabis.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. I mean, I think it's also interesting to see that the first psychedelic compound, even though MDMA isn't strictly a psychedelic compound, but the first of these compounds that looks like it will get regulated by the FDA for treating for PTSD, treatment-resistant PTSD, is MDMA, and of course, and ketamine is also in the States now getting approved for treating depression. It's interesting that it's these synthesized substances that are getting in through the door before these natural plant-based ones are. And why is that? Is that a sort of inherent fear about? I mean, why is something like ayahuasca or peyote use or whatever that's been around for a long time is still very much at the fringes, but MDMA and ketamine,
they're more tainted by a kind of hostile cultural associations, strangely. But ketamine has been legal for a long time as an anesthetic, so it didn't have to overcome that barrier. And actually, psilocybin is showing itself as a more successful, longer-lasting effect than ketamine by a long way. Ketamine lasts for maybe a fortnight, overcoming depression, whereas psilocybin can last 6 months, our research shows. And so, it's a better substance, but it's more held at, and it's in the highest category of harm and no medical use, which is Schedule 1. And at the moment, I've just written a letter to our new Prime Minister suggesting that he reschedule psilocybin to Schedule 2, where it obviously should be, because then it's cheaper to do research and doctors can prescribe it. But
it's just been decriminalised in Denver and...
no, they've talked about it.
Oakland, sorry. Oakland,
they've opened the conversation.
And just on ketamine, I think this notion of it being a horse tranquilizer is basically an urban myth, isn't it? It's actually one of the most sort of widely used analgesics. Yes, exactly. So it's essentially quite a safe compound.
I think it's quite safe. Although I think it can have bad applications.
Yeah, of course. I'm sure there must be some questions now. At the back there, Ruth.
I've got 2 questions actually. One is about DMT. Way back I used to do work with paranormal, and we worked with mass populations, looking for statistics. Then we also worked with people who were just known for being good at whatever it is, psychic things. And is it the ones who are very good? Do you think they have more natural DMT curves? Any research been on this?
Well, why not?
Why not? Yep.
Is there anybody in the Home Office who's got any knowledge of these things? Because we work with the Hempen Project people. It's one of our projects. Because you know that their license has just been revoked now, and they're just producing hemp for oils, for including the CBD supplement. And it was all fine until obviously someone in the Home Office thought, whoa, this could be really dangerous. They're getting in cannabis by that door. It's just crazy, isn't it? This day and age, that there's nobody in there who knows a damn thing.
Quite right.
Wonderful, thank you. David, maybe you could respond on the DMT question, and Amanda on the Home Office.
Yeah, very much. Thank you for that question. So, in regards to people who have who demonstrate better psychic abilities in laboratory research, we do this research. I do this research, and whether or not they have high levels of endogenous DMT is an interesting question, one that I've been trying to get to for a long time. But it's very difficult to map and monitor endogenous levels of DMT. You have to take blood samples and all the rest of it. I do have an ongoing project with a PhD student. We're going to be doing that very thing, actually. So maybe we'll have some data on that at some point soon. But currently, it's an open question. But thank you for that.
Well, on your remark, it's absolutely mad, our governments having completely no knowledge, and nor do our doctors. And now the last Home Secretary nobly legalized medical cannabis, but only because the Daily Mail was writing bad articles about him allowing epileptic children to die with 100 fits a day. And so he wanted to be the hero, and he regulated it. Well, good move, but bad reason. And then since then, about 6 prescriptions have been written, and I think 1 has been fulfilled, because none of the doctors are willing to put their signature to it, because none of them feel confident in writing a prescription, because they know nothing about it. So one's having to start educating doctors at the very bottom level. I mean, it's a terrible pickle. So.
Yes, this gentleman here.
I'm interested in understanding how you can use substances on a personal level for, I don't like the word altered consciousness, I like the idea of a better understanding
Enhanced
of myself.
consciousness, yeah.
But I also, because I've had terrible trips on acid, awful trips, so I'm quite not sure whether you actually need to take the substance. I mean,
I
more aware consciously by meditation? Or?
Absolutely, but like an old guru who asked me in the 60s, who forbid any compounds in his ashrams. He was also a brain surgeon, and he said, could I give him some LSD, which I did, and then I asked him, how did he like it, and he said, exactly what I know, but can I have some more, please?
This lady here, this gentleman here. So.
So I'm interested in the sort of effects in terms of depression on long-term depression, and I'd be happy to try anything, but I also suffer from anxiety, and my anxiety would be the bad trip issue. So is it possible to sort of control for that when you're using it for medical applications?
Can I just say something, because it's, I think, an area I have certain expertise on. Basically, take time-release vitamin C, if ever you take a psychedelic, because then you enable the body to make adrenaline, and adrenaline is what puts the sugar level up. And I think, but it's not proved, that bad trips and paranoias are very much associated with hypoglycemia, a drop in the sugar level. And so if you want to maintain your concentration on enhanced basis on a psychedelic, then you need to ingest more glucose to keep your sugar level normal. And I think then you win more go games and do more work, kind of thing. But if, just to have a good time, it doesn't matter.
And I mean, just on that, I think part of the reason why MDMA was studied for PTSD was that within the sort of armory of pharmaceuticals, it was the only anti-anxiolytic drug that was non-sedative. So it's the only, it enables people to go into this place of trauma without being sedated and be able to actually then work with it.
And it stimulates empathy.
Yeah.
So there's empathy for the self and also empathy for the sitter.
Sorry, this gentleman here and then the gentleman at the back afterwards.
things like that. And I'm not saying there weren't conscious racing things, actually. I think there are things that have affected me all my life. And a friend of mine says, rather naively, there are two types of people in the world, those who took acid and those who didn't. But it leaves this residue of the world is a little bit more complex and a little bit more connected than you ever thought. Yeah. But I think it's context. You'll get context. I don't think taking a bit of acid at home and putting the telly on is going to give you good telly.
Yeah, I completely agree with you.
There was a gentleman at the back. Yes, exactly, in the white shirt.
Do you think that there's the possibility of another great popularizer of psychedelics, like a Leary, who was very unequivocal about it, and spread it into the wider culture? When I guess LSD was in a similar position to the position it's in now in terms of the development of the academic use. And if there were this possibility of another Leary, would you welcome it or be very unhappy about it?
Well, it's a very good question. I'm sure you will have something interesting to say on that. I mean, Leary, a lot of people in the psychedelic sort of research area have a fairly sort of dim view of Leary because they felt he sort of spoiled everything for everybody. But I suppose in a sense there was probably always going to be an LSD evangelist at that time. I think a lot of the hope about this sort of psychedelic renaissance is that hopefully we might have learnt from those mistakes. I think that there are, something like Michael Pollan's book has, that was a massive book in the States, not so huge here, but it was a number one, New York Times bestseller for weeks. And it's really the fact that a sort of mainstream commentator who's associated with sort of good home cooking and organic agriculture and the rest of it is suddenly at the age of 65 with a mild heart condition doing ayahuasca and smoking 5-MeO DMT from the Bufo alvarez toad, is quite extraordinary. And I think it's that I'd rather see it like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring for the environmental movement. I think in 10 years' time we'll look back and see Pollan's book as being a bit of a watershed moment. But I'm sure Amanda and David might have things to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Leary he left quite a wake of damage just because he overplayed it, and he overplayed the ego, and he overplayed it. And it was a very good thing to hook onto for authorities to be totally against. I mean, it's amazing the satchel of bad publicity that LSD has for such a wonderful, subtle, delicate ultra-consciousness. You'd think it was some monster. And I just look forward to slowly with that being washed away. And I have always thought ever since the 60s, actually, the best way to do it is through the best science, because science is the religion of the time, and people can't really contradict it if it's kind of legitimate science. And that's the one builds the steps towards respectability. And then, LSD.
There's a bit of a catch-22 going on, and with the greatest respect, you want to have your cake, which is the powering quality of these drugs, and you also want to eat it because it requires a degree of containment and control, or again it becomes a subcut. It's a really, it feels almost like an impossible thing to manage.
The trouble is once is swung completely out of natural balance, it's very difficult to get it back into a natural balance.
Yeah,
and I think that's what we're going through.
Yeah,
full of trouble.
There's quite a good Leary quote I came across the other day, was that LSD occasionally causes psychotic behaviour in people who haven't taken it. Michelle, I think you had your hand up. Yes? Did you have? Yes.
I've never taken any psychedelics. Would you recommend next weekend I go ahead and try it? And if I do, how do I set that up?
Well, I don't know who wants to answer that, because as you know, these are still illegal substances in this country. So I recommend you go somewhere where you could do it legally, like South America, for an ayahuasca ceremony.
Would you recommend an ayahuasca ceremony?
Well, I think like all these things, there's a lot of this ayahuasca tourism phenomenon in places like Peru. There are an awful lot of fairly dodgy characters peddling so there are, and these are where the horror stories are coming out, and where there are occasional, and interestingly, the casualties aren't really from the ayahuasca itself. It's usually either from something else in the brew, like too much tobacco or too much datura, or somebody with some kind of latent psychosis that suddenly erupts. But I do think that by all accounts, I mean, I haven't spent time there, but there are brujo sort of shaman, who are sort of more on the sort of dark side of the equation. So I think you need to be very, very careful about where you go. It's absolutely crucial that whoever is facilitating and holding this space is somebody that's been recommended to you. You feel comfortable there. It's absolutely not to go wandering in aimlessly to a situation like that, because that's where it goes wrong.
Failing that, there's a TripAdvisor, which couldn't have been more appropriately named. I mean, you can literally go on there and search for ayahuasca retreats in Quito or Iquitos.
It's very funny. Sorry, Josh, yes.
Given it's kind of linked to the theory question, but given the moral crackdown in the late 60s on psychedelics, how careful and pragmatic do we need to be about how fast it sort of gathers pace as a movement now?
I think one has to be a little bit cautious, but not too cautious, or some of us might be dead before it has effect. So I think as one gets older, one gets more radical, wanting to move faster, and that's personally my position.
Did you want to say something?
I think psychiatry is in crisis. I think these substances like psilocybin and MDMA have been fast-tracked for licensing. I think that's no bad thing, because if we wait 20 years for them to go through the normal regulatory channels, it's going to be, there's 20 extra years of mental health crisis. And I think they do have huge potential in treating mental health conditions. They also seemingly are related very much to people's changes in ecological consciousness, which is really one of the most serious issues we have right now is our current ecological crisis. And I think they may even have a role in helping people be more ecologically orientated. So I don't think we can go quite fast enough, but at the same time it needs to be done in a held and contained way.
Yes, David.
I mean, I do want to say something a bit polemical, and it is that I don't think ayahuasca tourism is held in very good regard by a number of people in Peru and Colombia and Bolivia, because in many cases, we are going there without any knowledge of the context and of the impact that we're having by trying to look after our well-being, but we're not very curious about what's going on in these places. We don't know much about the culture. We're not reading about the context. And actually, that context has a lot of really interesting things to say about our own lives. So I would say, back to your point about whether you're going to take psychedelics, I would say, in addition to reading about who you're going to take it with and the setting and so on, and if you're going to take a traditional psychedelic like ayahuasca, it would be great for you to read up on what ayahuasca actually is from people who are from there, and to enter a conversation with that. Because I think what's happening now is that a lot of this culture is being co-opted and exploited, and it's not benefiting the people locally.
No, it's an absolutely crucial point. Cultural appropriation and all of this. And suddenly there are lots of budding shamans on the scene. So I think it's a very crucial point.
And it's a great shame that people with your aquarium, which there are a great many, is that that's what a more regulated market would create. I mean, if it was prescribable by a doctor, you could go to a doctor and say, look, I've got certain problems in my family, this, that, and other. I think a psychedelic session could help me. And then you could go.
Prescription-based then?
Sorry? I think that's one way forward. I don't think it's ideal. But I think in this kind of regulated, prohibitionist world we've created for ourselves, it's, opens the door so you could have your psychedelic experience in a safe setting and then hopefully be allowed to, if God's permit or the state permits, and do it legally in your own sitting room, or wood.
Yes, Rick Doblin, who runs MAPS in America, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, who's really driving this MDMA through the FDA process, etc. He often makes an analogy with the hospice movement and this sort of vision for basically sort of psychedelic therapy centers, safe, set and setting where these things can actually be administered in the proper context with a qualified therapist. But I think this whole psychedelic therapy area is massive. I meet so many young people who are coming out of that sort of training, just very, very keen to go into that world, and I think we could see a huge explosion of interest in that.
I mean, I actually am working with the palliative care because I think that's a wonderful legal way to make good use of these compounds, is in trying to help people who
These extraordinary
problem with cognition, pain, mood, and psychedelics.
Well, some of these terminally ill people losing all fear of death, after one psilocybin session, and which never returns. I mean, that is profound, and the implications for that are really massive.
Beyond the kind of clinical as well, and the kind of therapeutic context. I mean, like we were talking about, recreational use. I mean, I think there's probably a room and consideration for other uses as well. And how do we regulate that, or how do we make it safe and for people? I mean, one context could be thinking about these things as in the same way we treat dangerous sports, which we know are actually typically more dangerous than taking psychedelics, as Dave Nutt points out. But you could have like psychedelic clubs, like you have like a paragliding club. I mean, it's not illegal to go and buy a paraglider and jump off a cliff, but it'd be really stupid to do that. So you might want to kind of go join a club first of all, get some flying hours under supervision, and then you're able to go flying your own paraglider or psychedelic yourself. That might be a useful way of kind of framing these things.
Yeah, as Alan Watts said, there are a lot of household domestic products from, like ammonia and household matches and whiskey or whatever that, with inappropriate use could, of course, be very dangerous. It's about, how these things are used, obviously. I think we're going to have to wrap up now. But I know we could go on for ages, but I'm afraid we've got to change the room over for the next event. But do feel free to come and grab any of us if you want to talk further. In 20 minutes' time, I'll be talking to Jojo Mehta about eradicating ecocide. She was Polly Higgins' co-founder in this initiative about making ecocide a crime against humanity. Do join us for that. Oh, and one last thing I forgot to mention is Dave Luke's fantastic psychedelic conference, Breaking Convention, which will be happening in London, middle of August. Where Shane Mouse will also be appearing. I'm sure Amanda is probably going to be there. I'm doing an event on psychedelic biophilia with David and others. I'm also, and DMT Dialogues, if anybody's interested in a copy of that, we've got some copies here. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Amanda, Dave and David. Thank you. Thank you so much.